welcome back to the channel. It is the BS Spooktober.
My favorite time of year.
And this is our 31 days of Halloween, where we are bringing you a video every day. And today we are talking about Venom.
That's me.
For those of you unfamiliar with the plot of this movie, this is a story about Venom, which is a symbiote that takes over, in the comics, Peter Parker, and becomes one with him, and they become Venom themselves. In this movie, we are going into Eddie Brock's timeline, which is another version that Venom goes into, and he is a reporter, and he is looking into some corruptions with the Life Foundation, which may or may not tie into the movie Life. And things happen from there.
So, a lot happens in this movie, and it's a little bit of a mess, to say the least. What can we say about this plot, without spoiling it for you guys? There's a lot in this movie that I think comes down to, like, generic superhero silliness. And definitely, like, the first good chunk of the film, I think, spends far too long trying to race its way to Venom.
It feels very rushed. It feels like they're just trying to squeeze in this origin story so then you can actually have him bond with Eddie and go from there. And it just, I feel like it was unnecessary. Like, I feel like they could have done that in a much different narrative way and it would have been more intriguing as an audience member. I was bored and annoyed.
But because they were racing through it, it felt very choppy. The first chunk of the plot felt like they were just cutting scenes short, or you didn't get time to sit in anywhere. So much has happened in the first little bit just to get you there. It kind of knocks you out of, like, I guess, your immersion while watching the film. And I definitely think the film improves once Eddie receives the symbiote, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. And from there, I think it's a pretty average superhero film.
I feel like Act 1 was trash. Act 2 was actually pretty decent and damn enjoyable. And then Act 3 was like, meh.
Yeah, because as most superhero films go nowadays, it does fall into the trap that the third act is pretty much a giant CGI fest.
I mean, I liked some of it. But storyline-wise, it was meh. So let's talk about characters, and we'll start with Eddie Brock, played by Tom Hardy. I was very skeptical at first as we were watching this. I really hated the character of Eddie Brock, which I feel like you're maybe supposed to a little bit, but I'm not quite sure if that was intentional or not, but I hated him as a character. I was like, I don't know if I could root for this guy this whole movie. And then once he bonds with Venom, he gets a little bit better, and Tom Hardy kind of finds his place in this role, I feel. And it was intriguing after that. But Eddie Brock as Eddie Brock,
I find that Tom Hardy is strongest in roles that are a little bit more, I want to say, like, one-dimensional, or, like, not necessarily one-dimensional, very clearly defined role. I feel like
Bane and Mad Max.
I feel like Eddie is supposed to be, like, charming, but flawed, but also edgy, and
which I feel like happens, but not on his own. He has to be with someone else.
I really did not feel the charisma from him that I felt like the movie was trying to be like, look how charismatic he is.
Agreed.
And I felt zero charisma from him. And it made a lot of scenes almost feel a little awkward until later because of how the movie was clearly like, it's working. He's so cool and charming. And you're like, no, he's not. I also, personal pet peeve, I find that Tom Hardy mumbles a lot of his lines.
Yes.
And
which works for the character of Mad Max, but not for this.
He honestly enunciates better in The Dark Knight Rises when he has a big mask on his face.
And has to, like, over-enunciate.
That's saying something, just because there were a couple scenes where I was, like, having to listen very closely because he loves to, like, mumble through his lines and to not really speak clearly enough for you to understand. Which didn't happen the whole movie, but it was enough that there was a couple times where I was like, what'd he say? By far the best person in this movie, the best character in this movie, is Venom. He is very funny, and the opposite of Eddie in that he is charming, and he's mostly just a voice for this film, and especially his relationship with Eddie and the way that they banter back and forth and their interaction is what saves this film from being just a huge turd in the wind. and is actually really enjoyable to see them talk back and forth and their relationship.
Best friends forever.
I personally was very not into this film until Venom showed up and paired with Eddie, and I was like head over heels after that. They were absolutely hilarious, and the comedic timing with them was great, and I just love all of their scenes together. That's like the only thing I like about this movie, is all of the scenes where Eddie and Venom are going back and forth are just gold. And then we swing back to characters who are not so impressive, and that is Eddie's fiance at the beginning of the film, Anne, who is played by Michelle Williams. I really like Michelle Williams. I think she's a great actress. I think this was a terrible role for her to take. This runs into the problem of the girlfriend, wife, fiance, whatever character furthering the plot for the male fuck-up. And I just hate that narrative so much. And there are a few times where Michelle Williams' acting and charm, I think, shines through enough to where it's a little bit more redeemable, but overall her character is written very cliche and very poorly, in my opinion, and it was just really disappointing.
I think she ends up falling into the trope that you see in a lot of superhero movies, especially like in the Superman movies, Amy Adams, Lois Lane, who they constantly try to figure out how to make her useful because they recognize the fact that she's just kind of there. And so she keeps popping up at all these places and doing things. And she's like his sidekick that it works out because they are secretly in love, not secret. And it just doesn't work. It's an old trope. It feels very dated for these superhero movies. And you think at this point they could write a realistic female character. Or if you can't do that, maybe you should just get rid of her. Because this film could have worked fine without her in it at all.
I also feel like this film suffers from borrowing from a lot of other superhero films that have already happened. Like a lot of just, maybe not the plot directly, but just certain scenes being framed in certain ways. Like this was very reminiscent of SpiderMan, which I know that it's like related to SpiderMan. I get that, don't come at me.
We'll
but
get
like
back
it was
to
a little too similar in the way that like Eddie gets powers and like, you know, how he's clumsy and weird, and then like the timeline felt very similar. I felt like Anne was very much a Gwen Stacy or very much a Pepper, and it just felt like I was watching old things put into new packaging, and it was a bummer.
And then you have the villain in this film, and he's okay. I actually didn't mind the actor who played him.
He acted the part really well, but the part's not great. It's another Michelle Williams issue.
Yeah, it felt like they didn't know what to do besides make him a giant evil megalomaniac with no empathy. There's no reason for you to actually, like, stop for a second and be like, oh, well, maybe this guy has a point, or he makes a good antagonist for these reasons. That never really happens. It's more just that he's an angry guy who has men to throw at Venom, and for that reason he's intimidating, and I don't think he carries necessarily the weight that a good villain should.
While I did enjoy the Eddie and Venom dynamic, and that did save a lot of the film for me, I'm still really disappointed that this falls into the common issue that superhero films have where it feels like a boys' club, because the female characters are honestly quite shitty. You have Michelle Williams' character, which we already talked about. Jenny Slate plays a character that's only meant to further the plot for the male characters. Like, she doesn't really have a whole lot of substance to her, and she was an interesting character, and they just didn't do a whole lot with her. And we have a couple of other minor female characters as well, very minor, and they're just there as props, essentially. And it's really disappointing, especially with all of the kick-ass ladies we have in comic books nowadays. I understand that this isn't a female-led film. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm just asking for more than it's giving us.
So overall, I think there's a lot to not like about this film. Like we said, it feels a little bit dated. I think the writing quality for most of the characters is pretty poor, even our main character. I think it does shine where it truly matters, in that the relationship between Venom and Eddie is very fun on screen and hilarious and enjoyable. And despite some of the things that don't necessarily make sense plot-wise in those scenes, they brought a level of fun to it that you cannot care. But because that is not the entire film, there's a large chunk of the film that does not exist in, it can't necessarily hold the film up on its own. So while we didn't feel like it was a waste of time, it still was not very good. Like, I'm not rushing to go back and rewatch it.
With that being said, though, I'm really interested to see if they can fix some of their mistakes for the second one. I am intrigued enough with the Venom Eddie dynamic to want to watch a second one. I also quite like where they're going with the direction with the end credit scene. That wraps up our full thoughts on Venom. Let us know if you've seen it, what your thoughts are. Did our review change your mind on if you want to see it or not? Let us know. Leave a thumbs up down below if you're enjoying BS Spooktober. We have more new releases coming your way, as well as some more spooky content. So we hope that you subscribe to see more of our videos, and we will see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Bye-bye.